Hi again, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. Really excited to be here. This is the first time facilitating, so wish me luck. Fingers crossed everything goes well. My name is Adil. I'll be taking over from Luz for this afternoon. For those of you that might still be looking for her, she'll definitely be back next month. She's just off doing some regenerative collaboration somewhere out in the world and sends her regards. To any new faces, welcome, and to all the old faces and all that we have here, Happy New Year, and we're glad to have you with us here today. We are the Regenerative Collaborative of South Africa, a nonprofit organization focused on transforming our built environment into a regenerative one. We host webinars on the last Thursday of every month, where we promote strategies and approaches that bring regenerative design and construction to life. We work collectively to inspire, educate, create awareness, and contextualize regenerative built environment approaches to the South African and African context. We make an effort to showcase local projects, local people, and local companies that are aligned with our goal of creating a regenerative future. If you want to have a look at all the amazing speakers we've shared our platform with, please check out our YouTube channel. It really help us out if you subscribe as well, so we can get these stories out to the world. Our entire database of webinars from 2021 to date are uploaded, free to view as many times as you'd like. So have a look and let us know in the comments which one's your favorite and maybe which one you'd like us to follow up on. We also encourage you to follow our socials. We are getting up there really quickly, and we appreciate your support across all our platforms. If you're already a subscriber, thank you. We really appreciate you. Remember to share with a friend and a family. It's all good vibes. If you want to be a part of our team, we're always on the lookout for volunteers and would gladly take on board any skills you have to offer. Reach out to us and be a part of the regeneration revolution. We'd also like to make an official call out for sponsors, as all our members and volunteers are volunteers. This would go directly into getting our marketing and CPD accreditation validated. If you know of a person, a company, or organization that would be willing to sponsor us, please let us know and we can reach out to them, or alternatively, ask them to reach out to us. And that's our housekeeping done, and brings us back to the focus of today, interspecies design. I must say, I am really looking forward to this one. We've got 3 amazing graduate students presenting their work under the supervision of Marc Sherratt, who's a longtime friend of the Rcsa. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to make it today, but we still consider him a friend regardless. He did share some background about what we can expect and on what the brief of the students was, which we'll be looking at in the next couple of slides. So this unit of interspecies design focuses on the climate crisis, the rapid urban growth and ecosystem collapse, forcing African people and their iconic wildlife to live in ever closer proximity. We see that this will create spaces of conflict and fear that the architects will have an opportunity to sensitively heal and mediate using the unique skill set of designing space for life to thrive. Greenfield sites within African cities are important refugia for urban wildlife and their migration. And architects are commonly discouraged from intervening in these sites of high ecological sensitivity. In Johannesburg, many of these sites are under existential threat from poor management, pollution, land invasion, overutilization, and the like. This unit then questioned what role architects can play in integrating systems, or in integrating design space rather, into complex ecological systems for the benefit of both humans and urban wildlife. The unit sits within the experimental ecological science of urban rewilding and uses the technical frameworks of the Green Building Council of South Africa's rating systems as a lens to question what cutting-edge environmental architectural design looks like in South Africa currently. It sits across the disciplines of landscape, architecture, and green building consulting. The unit's chosen site focuses on publicly accessible, threatened greenfield sites within the city and rigorously maps these disappearing ecological systems using architectural drawing. The unit's outputs offer architectural responses to significant threats and management responses to of these landscapes with an aim to upskill and inspire local communities with alternative definitions of what urban nature conservation could look like. Certainly a mouthful, but I'm sure the presenters will have a good idea of what it's more about and give us a bit more in-depth detail. And yeah, looking forward to introducing our first speaker, Courtney, who is a 25-year-old South African architectural graduate with a passion for art, design, music, and learning, who has recently completed his Master of Architecture at the University of Johannesburg, the Graduate School of Architecture. Following Courtney, we're going to have our second speaker, Tshekedi, who is an architectural designer and sustainability consultant working at the intersection of regenerative architecture, indigenous knowledge systems, and ecological futures. His work is grounded in research-led design methodologies that explore how architecture can actively participate in ecological regeneration, cultural memory, and interspecies coexistence. Last but definitely not least, we have Itumeleng, who is a candidate architect and Master of Architecture graduate at the University of Johannesburg. With over 3 years of experience in high-end residential and commercial architectural practice, his work explores architecture as an active ecological agent, integrating sustainable design and landscape-driven narratives. So yeah, without further ado, let me hand over to Courtney, who's going to kick us off.
Hi, everyone. My name is Courtney, like we mentioned, and today I would like to be presenting my Master of Architecture thesis on how architecture can play a role in preventing the spread of disease in Johannesburg due to our rapidly changing climate. So by 2050, there's projected climate data that predicts that South Africa's climate is going to be much more akin to where malaria-prone regions are today. These climates are going to spread further into South Africa and are going to move into where spaces like Johannesburg are. And this is due to climate change. It's due to our rapidly changing environment, higher average temperatures, and increasing rainfall, which actually creates suitable breeding conditions for things like mosquitoes. Thinking about the Glen Austin Pan itself, it's a wildlife sanctuary that consists of mostly stagnant water. And it becomes interesting in that way because it's next to very high density residential areas. And those two would be the Glen Austin suburb and then the Tembisa township. And this kind of creates a very interesting political boundary between the two, a contrast between the two. That became quite an interesting point to study, especially in terms of disease, because we start questioning things like access to healthcare, medication, hospitals, things along those lines. The drawing you see in front of you is kind of a interrogation of how different species of mosquitoes could travel throughout this area in Midrand, and how using Glen Austin as like a primary point of infection, how it could spread to different stagnant pools of water and just increase across Johannesburg in a way. So moving more into the Glen Austin Pan itself, I began to study how the site actually changed ecologically over the past decade or so. And what I found was a large increase in water levels over time, which has provided more real estate, you could say, for mosquitoes to breed within these areas. So the water level steadily rose over time. And with that came an increase in different types of flora and fauna, especially stuff like the giant reed species, which is an invasive species. So I became interested in looking at how invasive species has taken over the landscape itself, which have actually altered the existing landscape of the site. It's an Egoli granite grassland. And so that's kind of been changing over time due to these invasive species. And so that's been inviting new animals and insects, bird species, stuff like that onto the site and actually changing it intrinsically. So from there, I kind of wanted to zoom in. I started creating sectional drawings to help understand the relationship between all the species on site, may that be humans or birds or insects or the like. The site itself has a lot of animals all around, within this ecosystem, and when they all take part in their own rituals and whatever. So I thought it would be interesting to really dig deep into the site itself and see how they interact together. I created 2 sections to look at a day section during winter and a night section during the summer. And these 2 different sections help me understand what points of intersection would be most important to look at if I was to design towards preventing disease in a place with such stagnant water. Actually, going on site, I took some water and did some studies and found that there was an infestation of mosquitoes on the site. And through microanalysis, I could better understand mosquito physiology and the life cycles of mosquitoes. Just really helped me get a better understanding of the species itself. What I got myself here, which is this main photo, is a mosquito larva, which spends most of its life underwater until it emerges as the adult mosquito, which I found quite interesting. And because of that, it kind of drove me to different avenues of understanding how the species worked and what I could do to interact with that understanding of the species. So through all this research of the mosquito, I tried to understand, especially with the mosquito larva, what goes into reproduction of the species and how maybe that can be a point for me to intersect architecture and control the species through that. So I started looking at heat of water. And so this drawing that you see in front of you is kind of a 3D visualization of the site itself. You can probably see a faint line, that would be the water is on the pan. And I started looking at things like this map is flora density. So where there's more flora, it would be colder water. Maybe the mosquitoes wouldn't like to reproduce there as much. This one is looking more at the depth of the water. So shallower waters would be heated up faster. Maybe that's where they would like to reproduce. And this final one is light pollution. And from my research, it seemed that mosquitoes seem to prefer darker areas to lay their eggs. And then after that, they seek blood hosts in brighter areas. Through that, I kind of created these projections that gave me a spatial reference for how architecture could sit in the site based on the actual density of heat in the area and how I projected that mosquitoes would prefer to lay their eggs, I guess, which gave me a cool reference for the actual architecture that would continue in the future. Through my research of mosquitoes, I started looking at light pollution. It's something that came across as something that could attract and repulse certain species. So I did a little bit of an in-depth analysis on types of light pollution and wavelength of colors that could maybe be used and implemented on a design to draw mosquitoes to a specific place and like manipulate the way they move through a site. So through this, I learned which colors may attract the mosquitoes, but I was also looking at light pollution in the context of the ecosystem to make sure that using specific wavelengths of light wouldn't hurt the existing species on site and disrupt their ecosystem. I took that research and I wanted to base it within a material like experiment. So I started looking at tensile materials. I'm sure a lot of us know that people use mosquito netting to trap mosquitoes, and I kind of wanted to take that idea, expand it a little bit and understand which materials would be best for looking at the tensile or the tensile nature of a material, how much light it would let through, or how easy it would be to capture these tiny little insects. I looked through a bunch of these things and experimented a bit in what ways they could be best implemented within my site as well. And so that really brought me to my concept design phase, where from all that research, I developed a concept of a lightweight net structure that would be strategically placed on the site to guide, control, and capture mosquitoes, ultimately for the purpose of like disease research and prevention, you know, for people that are actually studying these, how they could implement strategies on the site to prevent the spread of disease in the area or something along those lines. Through a process of looking at different concept designs and sections, sketches, all that, I came to this idea of a simple pole system that could be used with hinges that could move dynamically depending on the needs of a researcher perhaps on the site. I found it worked quite well to create a bunch of different typologies that could be used on site and implemented differently to allow for different programs. For example, this first drawing here is more of a simple program that restricts the movement of the mosquito. It can trap them. It allows researchers to access the water, take samples, release genetically modified mosquitoes, which I'll talk about more just now. But it was more of a simpler, easier to access typology. The second one here more looks at a way that you could manipulate the movement of other species within the net. So it's through the angles of these poles, maybe you could allow bats to pass through and, you know, eat up the mosquitoes, creating a way of pest control, I guess, which could be used in different areas to capture a certain amount of mosquitoes, stuff like that. And the last one would be like a much larger netting design or strategy that is where the hotspot of mosquitoes would be, where the most amount of mosquitoes would be. And this would be captured by a light trap that I designed that would kind of siphon them to the top and collect them for researchers to do studies on, you know, just do what I did, do a little bit of microbiology, I guess. So I had that idea of the section plan, and I wanted to, you know, understand how this was going to sit on site, how it could work most conveniently, specifically access points, entryway points, and then really being able to hit each part of the site where I knew there would be the most amount of reproduction based on those heat maps that I did. So I came to this final design that, you know, you can see the overall mosquito netting branching across the water, hitting those hotspots. There would be the timber pathways crossing throughout the water, making sure there's an access for the researchers to access the water and understand if there's an infection there, if there's disease prevalent within these mosquitoes. And then connecting each side, which would kind of be your entry point into either side of the design, would be research centers that had laboratories for the researchers to really do a lot of their, you know, indoor type of experiments. So talking about these research centers, they're quite simple. A lot of it is used for observation, like observational decks. And then within there would be a controlled research environment, like a laboratory, where they could take the samples that they've collected and, you know, create, you know, whatever they need, genetically modified mosquitoes, stuff like that, to control the amount of infected mosquitoes that may be, you know, released. And so stuff like genetically modified mosquitoes, like kind of things that sound very far out there, but are strategies that they use today, it would be a place to be able to develop those strategies and create those experiments. So my design really was about creating a space that was malleable enough, I guess is a word, to allow for experimentation and allow for alternate strategies to control disease. The facade of the laboratories itself was just a simple idea of some timber bath boxes, and so the kind of structure itself would be encased with a timber bath box, and that would kind of allow the promotion of on-site access for mosquito predators to integrate with my design to really promote the interaction between those two species. And then the public pathway that I was talking about, I really wanted it to be simple, to be able to hit all the spots in the water where I knew there would be a lot of mosquito larvae popping up, especially as they became more prevalent. So I wanted to look at easy access into the water for collection of species and release of genetically modified mosquitoes, some observation decks for the observation of experimentation and if predators are successfully catching the mosquitoes. And then also there needed to be access to the traps so that you could be able to clean them out, gather your mosquitoes, you know, put it back, stuff like that. These next few slides are just a long section trying to really get an understanding of how the design would look on site and how it could be changed through alternative netting design strategies, and then how mosquitoes would move about throughout there. I also wanted to just show the details of how these traps and how the timber pathway would just work together all as a cohesive design, and just maybe show the beauty of the lights and how it would, you know, hopefully not disrupt too much from the landscape. Another interesting factor is that I talked about genetically modified mosquitoes. What I found through my research is that UV light tends to make the genetically modified mosquitoes glow in the dark, which I thought was a little cool fact of maybe something that's looked visually interesting. So I got to doing the perspectives, and I kind of tried to put all these things together, look at all the lighting, see the actual design as an experiential effect on the person. Like you could see the bats traveling through, you could see those glow in the dark mosquitoes. And so my perspectives, I really wanted to help create an understanding of how this place would be living and breathing, and not so much a static design, but something that can change and is very in tune with our theme of interspecies design, something that's living and breathing at the same time. And so I did want to just at the end talk about, like, during the daytime, how would this design change? And I created this alternative usage strategy that maybe would be during the winter times, during the day, because the site itself is a site with a lot of birds. It's a wildlife sanctuary. So another use for it would be during the winter times. It could be used like as a public park, a walkway for people to enjoy at their leisure, and be able to see all these birds and enjoy it in that sense as well, just so it's not too thought as like this research heavy area. I thought that would be quite an exciting way to reuse it. And yeah, that's it. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Courtney. I must say I haven't given a lot of thought into mosquitoes, and it's really cool to see how you've integrated that into your design. If you have any questions, please pop them into the chat box for now, and we'll get to them in the Q&A. I'm just going to ask the next speaker, Tshekedi, if you're ready. You can go ahead, man.
Good afternoon, everyone. So my project I'd like to share is called Sereto Lefatshe, which means the praise song of the earth. This project begins not with architecture, but with a totem, a way of understanding life, land, and death, and belonging as part of one living system. It asks a simple but radical question. What if architecture didn't resist decay, death, and time, but worked with them? Sereto means praise poem or ritual narration. Lefatshe means earth, soil, and ground. Together, Sereto Lefatshe means architecture as a ritual ecology. Buildings not as objects, but as participants in ecological and spiritual cycles. This frames architecture not as something we place on land, but something that listens, responds, and returns to the land. Regenerative architecture moves beyond sustainability in my project. Instead of asking, how do we reduce harm, it asks, how do we actively repair ecosystems and social relationships? Here, architecture becomes soil as a healer. It becomes a carbon sink collector, and it becomes a habitat for generators, as well as a ritual infrastructure. And importantly, regeneration is not only technical, it is cultural, spiritual, and relational. Before proposing solutions, I started with the land. Johannesburg is rapidly losing greenfield sites through mining, infrastructure expansion, and urban development. One of the most threatened ecosystems here is the Igoli granite grassland, which is now critically endangered. These landscapes are not empty. They are ecological infrastructure, carbon sinks, and memory carriers, as well as, in some cases, spiritual territories. Yet development continues as if land is neutral and the ground is just a place for exhibition or amusement. This project also asks, what kind of architecture emerges when land is treated as sacred, alive, and finite? The second problem is burial. Across cities, cemeteries are spatially unsustainable, ecologically extractive, and separated from everyday life and land cycles. They treat death as containment rather than transformation, and soul as storage rather than kin. Burial becomes a zoning problem, not an ecological or spiritual one. This project reframes burial as land care, not land consumption. Our current burial policies are structured around permanence, ownership, plot-based land tenure, and concrete containment. They assume land is infinite and bodies are waste, but climate collapses. Urban spaces densify and ecological loss demand new burial frameworks, where we consider the idea of seasonal burial, ecological return, and land restorative death practices. This project then positions itself where burial becomes a policy as an environmental government, not administration. This leads me to the core of my research question. How can architecture mediate between Western permanence-based cosmologies and indigenous regenerative cosmologies, particularly around burial, decay, and preservation? Rather than choosing one worldview over the other, this project explores the productive tension, where monument is challenged between return and control is challenged between reciprocity, and preservation is challenged between regeneration. This tension then becomes not a conflict, but a design opportunity. Ritual ecology recognizes that indigenous rituals are not symbolic performances. They are ecological technologies where burial, praise poetry, sacrifice, and seasonal gathering can take place. These are systems of land management, memory preservation, and regenerative care. In this project, death is not failure. It is transformation and return, and architecture becomes a ritual device that supports these cycles. This project is framed as a song, not a master plan. The land already sings through water cycles, animal movement, seasonal decay, and vegetation succession. Architecture does not impose form. It listens, it harmonizes, and it translates. Drawing becomes my way of not just mapping space, but mapping memory, absence, spirit, and future possibilities. The site of my project is Glen Austin Pan in Midrand, a seasonal wetland under threat, yet rich in biodiversity and carbon sequestration potential. It is a liminal landscape, which is wet and dry, visible and invisible, and protected and endangered. This makes it ideal for a project about transition, burial, regeneration, and return to take place and to be tested. The project's anchor is a totem in a Tswana tribe, the Kwena, or the crocodile, a totem in the Bangwato and the Phuthi Tswana cosmology. The crocodile is a guardian of thresholds, a guardian of land and water, a guardian of life and death, and a guardian of presence and disappearance. Here, the crocodile becomes a symbol and a species, as well as a design intelligence. Its movements, its nesting abilities, its skin, and its ecology guide the architecture. Modern burial and land systems operate through necropolitics, managing death through control, zoning, and containment. This project proposes an ecopolitics of death, where death becomes soil regeneration, habitat creation, and carbon cycling, as well as cultural continuity, where death is not managed, but is cultivated. My first method is narrative architecture. So instead of starting with form or typology, I start with story and myth, ritual, totem, and memory, where architecture becomes a spatial storytelling tool, where movement through space becomes movement through ecology, cosmology, and time. And each of my structures is not a building, but a chapter in the land's ongoing narrative. The second methodology I use is totem as a perspective device. Rather than designing from the human gaze, I design through animal movement, seasonal cycles, and soil processes, where drawing becomes a way to map what is unseen, such as spirit, decay, absence, memory, and future ecologies, where the crocodile becomes not a decoration, but a design intelligence. As an example in this drawing then begins to represent decay and the current typologies of burial, where the soil is filled with embalming fluids. In my project as well, I think I propose new policy frameworks that consider seasonal burial permits, temporary and intermittent zones, ecological return corridors, and living memory landscapes. Burial law shifts from ownership and turns into stewardship. It shifts from containment and turns into regeneration, and it shifts from permanence and becomes a cycle, where policy becomes this ecological infrastructure that helps regenerate and preserve landscapes. Rather than a single permanent building, my architecture unfolds through three ritual ecologies. In the first phase, which is a pre-occupation, which is a construction phase of year 1, the site is prepared through listening rather than building, where hydrological repair, soil healing, and invasive species are removed, and rubble is harvested and create the bricks that will then build the architecture. Light and reversible structures are introduced, where earthworks, timber frames, and reef shelters establish spatial infrastructure without fixing form. In phase 2, which is occupation and the remembrance phase, the architecture becomes active as a landscape of gathering, mourning, teaching, and ritual. Spaces host ceremonies, storytelling, and ecological education, while structures remain adaptable, responding to seasonal water levels and collective use. Memory is held not in monuments, but in spatial rhythms and recurring practices. In the final phase, which is the burial and termination stage, the architecture shifts towards burial and ecological return. Bodies undergo termination, which is a natural way of burial, and soil-based decomposition, feeding vegetation, wetlands, and habitat regeneration. Structures are allowed to decay, compost, and dissolve back into the land, completing the architectural life cycle. Architecture becomes a process and not a product, a living system that builds, remembers, decomposes, and regenerates. Preservation here is not frozen buildings in time. Instead, construction rubble is collected and reused, demolition becomes material harvesting, and decayed zones become regenerative zones. The building phases align with ecological cycles and the systems of the existing landscape. And in these two drawings, these are then the examples of the architecture being built, existing, and slowly decaying. And then the final one then shows how the site begins to regenerate and the microbial system has fully interweaved into the landscape. My architectural proposition is organized as a ritual journey, not a fixed building. The burial procession moves through arrival and cleansing landscapes, gathering in remembrance courts, and termination in return zones, and is surrounded by regenerative wetlands and rehabilitated ecologies. Each of these spatial thresholds marks a transition from life to memory, from body to soil, and from individual to the ecosystem, where architecture becomes a path of transformation, where movement through the space becomes ritual, healing, and ecological return. This section shows how the architecture touches the site lightly. Rather than occupying it, the structures are created where the architecture floats above the floodlines and the grassland. The anchors are into the soil, but through the use of micropiles which avoid deep excavation. And this aligns with water and species flow and also create further enhancement through the burial zones. This section reveals architecture as a topography and an infrastructure of rituals and pathways, not as an object, but as a landscape extension. Buildings here become the threshold between the wet and dry, the life and death, and the human and the species, slowly bringing you back to this idea of architecture becoming a totem and a Sereto for the landscape. The woven wall is both a structure and a ritual membrane. It is constructed from timber lattices, reed and fiber and grass that is slowly weaved and that is used from invasive species, and the clay and earth fill that has been reconstructed and created to be used in the landscape. It performs multiple roles where it filters light, air, water, and sound, and allows growth, decay, and repair to take place, where it shows records of time through weathering and patching. The wall is not finished, but it evolves. It is built to be mended, composted, and rewoven, making construction a continuous ritual rather than a final act, where architecture becomes a woven ecology as opposed to an enclosure. This slide shows the imagination of the site after 50 years of the intervention having taken place, when architecture has largely returned into the land. The rammed earth walls in this design have slowly eroded with rain and wind, and the seed that has been integrated has surrounded the vegetation that is grown. becoming a topography rather than an object. And rather than the architecture being a permanent monument, memory is held through impermanent earth markers, story circles and gathering clearances, and pathways worn by repeated ritual use, where remembrance lives in soil patterns, vegetation growth, and oral storytelling. And what remains is not the building, but it is the regenerated wetland, the mature grassland succession, and the cultural memory embedded in the land. Going back to my materials strategy looks at composting, reuse, weathering, and returning to the soil, where clay, timber, reed, and mycelium composites are my palette of choice. And this then begins to argue the idea of decay becoming a performance and a way of transforming our design logic, where material are not finishes, but they are life cycles. In this diagram here, I'm trying to show regeneration taking place through burial, decay, and time. This tries to show you how terramation allows bodies to return safely and directly into the soil, feeding microbial life, fungal networks, and the vegetation of the landscape. And as the architecture weathers and erodes, the materials become soil structure, habitat substrate, and carbon reservoirs, where burial becomes a ritual act of land regeneration and architecture becomes a nutrient pathway, not an enclosure again. And together, the body, the building, and the landscape form a continuous system of return, regeneration, and renewal. Here, I tried to show a few proposals of burial typologies as spatial, ecological, and ritual infrastructures. These three alternative burial typologies are upright burials, where the bodies are returned vertically to the soil, allowing deep root systems and microbial layers to regenerate around them. The second one is orientated burial, where bodies are aligned with solar paths, water flows, and ancestral directions, embodying cosmology into the land and regeneration. And the final one is cremation seed burial, where ash is combined with soil and seed and allowing it to transform remains into living memorials, forests, and grassland corridors. Each of these typologies support microbial regeneration, soil formation, and cultural remembrance. This work aims to reframe burial as architecture, reposition decay as a design intelligence, and reclaim indigenous knowledge as future-facing and a sustainable way to regenerate, offering new policy frameworks rooted in land and ethics. And here I then show you some still images of how the architecture transforms, not only as a building and regeneration process, but as a way of bringing cultures and different personalities and perspectives into one, creating an architecture that serves not only the land, but the people that inhabit it. And in closing, I would like to leave a provocation where I ask you, what if buildings were not monuments for permanence, but rituals of return? What kind of cities emerge when we design not for survival, but for return? Thank you.
Wow, Tshekedi, wow. Yeah, really thought-provoking. I think from my side, one line that stuck with me was architecture to be seen as a continuous ritual rather than a final act. I think that one really follows through. And last but not least, Itumeleng, please, can you share your presentation with us?
My name is Itumeleng, as mentioned. I think my project asks a simple but yet urgent question. It asks, how can architecture act as a true agent of ecological repair, restoring biodiversity, while also educating the public about ecosystems and the life that supports it? My presentation is in segments, and the first segment I'll take you guys through is the frog, looking at a frog generally. And I think my personal view of what I see a frog is, I see a frog as a rainkeeper of some sort, because you only see these little amphibians when, before, after rain or during rain. So for me, I sort of see it as this rain god. And I think in this drawing, what I was trying to resemble is basically sort of that notion, that self view that I had of just a frog. And then I started looking into essentially what do frogs mean in certain cultures. And I did research, and I stumbled across a piece of research which then clarified that within the San culture, frogs are seen as a symbolism for puberty, especially for the girls. So when a frog goes from a tadpole into a fully fledged frog, it's linked to a woman or a girl, rather, sort of going through her puberty and becoming a woman. So it has sort of like these cultural links. In some cultures, I think in the north of Limpopo, it's seen, when you see a frog, it's seen as bad omen. Especially if maybe you see it in the household or anything like that. And then I start sort of trying to recognize it in terms of the ecosystem. What's the importance of this, or specifically the African bullfrog within the ecosystem? And essentially in this drawing, what I was trying to impose is basically the importance of the African bullfrog within its food chain. And I think this layered diagram tries to illustrate that basically within the ecosystem, the food it eats. So what eats it and what it eats at the same time. And it also sort of looks at basically what would happen if this frog species had to be extinct. And there'll be a number of issues. There'll be an increase, or rather a decrease in biodiversity, a decrease in predators that could potentially eat this frog. There'll be a decrease in water quality, because frogs usually are seen as an indicator species, and when you see them on site, it means that water is healthy. And subsequently, there'll be an increase in vector-borne diseases because of the increase of mosquitoes and so on and so forth. And then I moved on to basically the site. So this is a photograph that I took when I was on site, just to give you a clear picture of what the site looks like currently. And I think just to note, the site, it has still water, but what it's supposed to be essentially is an ephemeral pan, meaning within the dry season it's supposed to dry out, which is the winter season, and then in the hot season, which is summer, it's supposed to fill up because of the rain. But because of issues like stormwater, drainage, climate change, and all sorts of things that are affecting the pan, the pan currently is filled throughout the year, and subsequently this is not allowing basically this bullfrog species to breed enough. And because of that, I think over the last decade, the bullfrog species population has decreased by 80%. And this would be my personal journey on site, and using sort of the methodology of cartographic layering, I started documenting my experiences on site. The journey that I took, you'll see in the blue, and the samples that I collected sort of give me sort of an idea of the site and feel of what I'm dealing with. And then we move on to looking at the site and the frog, that relationship. And this drawing basically is, again, using the same methodology of cartography, where I layered basically the conditions of the site and basically the needs of the bullfrog. So to your left, you would see illustrations of essentially what the bullfrog needs to breed successfully. And then on your right is basically the conditions that the site, or the pressures that the site is experiencing, such as infrastructure pollution, infrastructure development, and we spoke about stormwater that's filling up the pan, and so on and so forth. And then at the center of it, we start looking basically at the sort of the environmental relationship between the frog and the site. And on the outer layer, you would see basically this is how the pan is supposed to perform, but it's not performing that way throughout the the seasons, and in correlation to basically the rain temperatures and the heat temperatures. And by sort of analyzing essentially the temperatures of the site, I was able to then understand the breeding patterns of the frog. And I think on this drawing, as complex as it is, I was able to understand that between the months of October and February is where essentially we have, I guess, the hottest temperature, but also it's where this frog normally breeds. We also have a lot of rain within those months and within that summer season, but also, you know, within the highest temperature, which is December, where you also experience a lot of rain and a lot of heat, is where you'd have a lot of breeding events. You will see basically in those black illustrations over there. So now I'm able to understand basically the critical time of this frog species. When is it most vulnerable on the site? And then I wanted to understand basically the relationship between the sites, the people that transverse the sites, and the frog. And so what I've done, again, with the methodology of layering and photography, is I took essentially the Barrow radii, which is basically the holes or homes of these bullfrogs, of which they inhabit within the winter season, and they stay there until it rains or until the summer. I took those radiuses and I sort of overlapped them with the existing infrastructure, such as roads, the existing plots, and also the informal pots that are essentially on site. And out of this, what I sort of deduced was essentially that there's a clash between the frog infrastructure and people, because as you see with the circle, which is the radius, the smaller one and the bigger one, the smaller one being for the male and the bigger one being for the female bullfrogs, is that, you know, these creatures are sort of susceptible to roadkill, human interference, so on and so forth. And then the plus signs are essentially the burrows I observed on site, which is the holes that they sort of lay in or sleep in, rather. And then this simply basically just understanding the distribution of the bullfrog within the Gauteng region. And I think just to give you a clear viewpoint of what the pan is supposed to look like, and I think take yourself back to the first image that I showed you of the site. This is essentially how the pan is supposed to perform. So in its dry season, it look, like that. So it's very sandy, and then within the wet season, the rainy season, it's supposed to be filled like the image below. And again, I started thinking about the uniqueness of a frog would be the sound it makes. So I started looking at the call, and I was very much interested in the call because I was thinking about an architecture that could, use frog calls in its design. But before I could get there, I needed to understand essentially all the frog species on site. So I listed all the frog species on site, and essentially the frog habitat, so where they would essentially sit on the site, and also understanding the patterns, the sound, waveforms they sort of make when they croak. And then obviously the next few slides would be, I guess, an illustration of all those frog species that I identified. And from this, I went on to then take the that research prompted me to basically lapse all those waveforms and sort of layer them again. So using the same methodology of layering, it's sort of deemed about a provocation to think about, since the bullfrog is an indicative species, how can I use the same, a uniqueness within my architecture? So I came up with this concept of the frog facade. So the idea behind this is basically the facade would be an indicator to the local residents or even scientists or ecologists that potentially are going to be inhabiting this building. And the idea is that using sound and using light, I'm able to then sort of give people this picture if whether or not the pan is healthy. And the idea is that the more these frogs call, the more complicated this frog facade becomes, because it then reacts to the calls and sort of illuminates using light, and then which then signifies that the pan is healthy. And obviously, when it's not performing the way it's supposed to perform, it's not illuminating, it doesn't have this complexity, then it means subsequently that there's something wrong with the pan. And then how I plan to do this is basically using a device called developed by Marc and his team, actually, called the Landia AI system. And here I sort of did like a light study, because again, certain species are very vulnerable to light. So I did a study where I needed to understand the amount of Kelvin temperature one and the lux luminance that I'll need for this facade to be successful, because we don't want to essentially chase these creatures and other species on site. And then essentially this would be, I guess, the summary of the frog call would be now looking at it in plan view and basically understanding how far do each of these frogs call from. And when I was looking at this drawing, it provoked or informed rather a spatial experience that I could use potentially in my building. And I think with that being said, we arrived to basically the concept of my building and the name of the building. The name of the building is the Lake of Letlametlo. And what the building is basically a building which seeks to be an artificial wetland. So I am essentially recreating or mimicking what the pan used to be, and trying to have the whole system of having something that would essentially lose water and bring back water, that natural element that what the pan used to be. And also looking at an architecture that could potentially connect the human to the non-human as well, and could be a place of education, teaching people about this frog species that's actually on site and it's degrading day by day, or we're close to actually losing it entirely. And I think from that drawing that I showed you guys earlier, I spoke about that becoming a spatial experience, and sort of that evoked a spatial diagram where I wanted to sort of have a building where, as you transversing the building, you're able to experience each call, each frog species on site, and actually see and engage. Because again, I'm trying to essentially connect the human and the non-human together. And then the blue circle would be essentially the artificial pan, which would have regulated weather temperatures that are just fit and right for the bullfrog to breed, so that it can increase its numbers. And also within the dry season, it will drain out the water and drain back the water when need be. And then I also thought about this concept of a lily pad when I was thinking about the form of this building. And the idea of floating really struck to me, or really came in mind, because I didn't want the building to feel divorced from its surrounding. So I think at that point, I thought maybe the concept of it being able to float on the existing pan, and will give it sort of this uniformity, this distinction, or not a distinction, but this uniqueness, and look like one system as opposed to just a building that's just placed on site. And I think from that lily pad concept, I think you're able to see it from the plan view. And what's interesting about sort of this floor plan is that this would be the existing pan, and at the center would be artificial pan. And from the top view, it sort of looks like, this the water is sort of seeping into the artificial pan, but it's actually not. And that's the thinking behind the lily pad as well, but also the experiential system that I wanted to create. So the idea of using circles, again, of trying to start experiencing certain moments, and then layering it basically with where essentially each frog would be. So you see these dotted lines, and the black dots is where some of the bullfrog species would be, and you will be able to see some of the burrows on site as well. I think that's illustrated with the X's there. And then obviously this building in itself needs to be, something that works. But also thinking about what about the frogs that are already damaged, for lack of a better word. And the idea of just having a rehabilitation center is very important, where vets or ecologists could come in and sort of treat or study these species. And I think that program was very core to this building. And then this is a site plan where you would see it in its context. So trying to understand it from that point of view. And again, I think taking you back to that concept, I think here we basically able to see, that concept of it floating just like a lily pad, and it being in its context and sitting within the context. And then I think also the idea of, as I touched on, the experiential note of it, is that I also wanted to be able to elevate the building at some point, because the pan in itself is a very intriguing view, and interesting enough, the pan is actually known to be a bird watching sanctuary. So I think making space for that, it was very important. Hence you'd see that the building on its roof, it's slightly angled. So you're able to sort of get sort of that experience and view of the existing pan as opposed to the artificial pan. And then I think just to get to the technicalities of how this building would work, I think in the center, you would see, again, the concept of a frog facade where, using this color, amber light, and the frogs calling, and, this facade begins to perform, which means that the pan is health, which means its biodiversity was very important. And, it would be very image to see at night. And the luminance was also very important, because what I've come upon in terms of research is that within the full moon, these frogs breed more. So getting that lux luminance that's equivalent to the full moon was very important. And essentially how this building would work would be you would start seeing the frogs at 3 levels: the level of the eye level, and the level at the top level, and the level at the highest top level. So looking from top down, and also looking at the view of the pan. And then how I'm trying to basically recreate the wetland is that I'll be draining out, so using a filtration system where I'll be draining out water from the existing pan and draining it back into the artificial pan to a certain minimal level. And what the bullfrog actually needs is only 600 millimeters worth of water. But currently the pan sits at, I think, 1.8 meters of water, which is not conducive enough. And also regulating water temperatures is also very important. So the building seeks to do that. And with the walkways that are already on site, or that I'm going to create, are elevated, so these bullfrogs are able to transverse underneath the walkway.
Again, brilliant presentation, Itumeleng. I love how you've managed to marry all of these different sensory experiences into one beautiful piece of architecture. And yeah, can we just take some time to give all our speakers a round of applause? I think they've really made Marc's life a lot easier in terms of hitting the brief so well. And yeah, that's gonna open us up to our question and answer session. I think we'll start off with the questions in the chat. I'm going to give an opportunity to those to go first. So Wolfgang, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
I really enjoyed presentations. Really fascinating and interesting. Each one in its own way. Quick one. I'm just organized.
Sorry, Wolfgang. I'm not sure if it was just on my side, but it was really tough to hear you. I'm assuming that question was directed to Courtney. Courtney, are you worried that the nets will trap bats and birds as well?
Yeah, it was definitely a consideration throughout the design process, because something like interspecies design is it's quite difficult to make sure that your structure, your design isn't it's doing what you want it to do. It's addressing the concerns that you have on the site, but you're not affecting any other species in the meantime. I think with the bird and bat problem of them getting stuck, I think I was trying to address that with the different ways you could manipulate the netting itself to allow passage through for certain species. But I can definitely understand how maybe that wouldn't be able to work. And at the end of the day, it might just be a thing of testing it and doing it like a bigger scale. When I was doing my master's, I did want to be able to test this design at a larger scale. I ran out of time a bit, but I think the idea is the material choice. So like the polyester mosquito netting, I think isn't too transparent, and along with the lighting, maybe it would divert some species from getting caught up in that netting. But yeah, I think that's one of the biggest things about this this unit that you might see with a few of the projects that we did. It's like it's a lot, but there's a lot of consideration that has to be taken into account, and it is about testing and understanding if these things would work in the context of the site. But yeah, I appreciate the question.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Courtney. Tato, do you want to go ahead and ask Tshekedi your question?
Sure. Tshekedi, sure. It's more around South Africa being the rainbow nation, and there's so many different cultures, spiritual beliefs, and how adaptable is your model or framework that you've developed to take those into consideration?
Thank you, Tato, for your question. So in my research, the idea is to make my proposals as plural as possible. I think as I was doing my research, I always had that understanding that people had different belief systems and ways of how they wanted to say their final farewells or memorialize their lost ones. So this idea of the framework is a way of allowing the environment to take precedence, and then the community and the culture to be second, and then finally the burial becomes this support that integrates all these three systems. So ultimately creating the system that always celebrates culture, always celebrates regeneration, and always celebrates the ecology ultimately.
Mm-hmm. But the first step being the ecological value.
Ultimately, the idea would be going onto the site and finding out what the site needs. And then from that, you then have consultations with the community and find out what they need. And then ultimately, then the framework then becomes this tool or this link that connects these two different systems, if I can say, into one ecosystem.
No, great. Thanks.
Thanks, Tato. Thanks, Tshekedi. I just see one more comment from Mondi. Is there any way we can access or read these presentations? So yeah, we will be uploading this onto YouTube, but you're more than welcome to contact the speakers directly and they can share it with you. Now I can open up the floor to any questions. I'm going to ask that if you have a question, please raise your hand and then we'll just follow through in the order that hands are raised. If there aren't any, I have a couple of questions I'd like to ask you guys. I think it's really interesting. I think the first one I'm gonna head over to Itumeleng. You mentioned that the title of your building is Lake of Letlametlo. Can you tell us more about it and what made you choose it and what it means?
Yeah, certainly. So essentially a lake is basically a space where, you know, animals are able to gather and reproduce. And obviously, I guess that's the entirety of this project, creating a space of reproduction, of regeneration, and rehabilitation as well. And then the name behind Letlametlo is actually a fading name, which is the African bullfrog in Limpopo. And I think a side note is that in Limpopo, it's actually seen as a nutritious source of food. So they actually eat this species. And I think it then justifies, you know, I guess the concept of trying to maintain or balance out the population of this endangered species.
No, awesome, man. Thanks. Definitely learned something there. Yeah, I think another one to maybe Courtney. I'm intrigued to want to understand, like, what made you choose mosquitoes over other sort of insect species that you might have found on site? Did you maybe get bitten a couple of times there, or yeah, just I just can't think of where I would have got an idea of you know, finding mosquitoes from.
Yeah, thank you. It's quite funny. I didn't want to choose mosquitoes. I mean, we started the year and we were told, you know, this is interspecies design. We're really trying to design around, you know, non-human species, like try to understand how to create architecture like that. And so I didn't know what I was going to do. Marc told us to, you know, go with something that gives an emotional response where you let that be good or bad. But I didn't really have anything until we went on sites and we kind of sussed out what the site was like, how the experience was like around there. And that's when I took some samples and we went to the biology lab. We just looked at some of the stuff, you know, plants, water, bugs, whatever. And then I found that mosquito thing and it disgusted me and I didn't know what it was. So I guess it just piqued my interest. And then discovering that, you know, from there, that, you know, there's an infestation of mosquitoes in this pan that, you know, I did not expect. I think that's where it came from, definitely.
Yeah, awesome, man. It's really intriguing. Sometimes we just happen upon things by accident, but I mean, your research really does, you know, bring things into perspective and really contextualizes the site around it for sure. Last one from my side, from Tshekedi. Like, when obviously the brief was interspecies design and understanding how all of these works together, what this being in like an architectural, you know, unit, how did you manage to come across looking at, you know, burial as being an architectural issue? Was that an experience from maybe your personal life, or is it something that's just always been on your mind?
Interesting again for me as well was in me choosing my theme or my topic, it was a very complicated back and forth. I think initially when all my other colleagues were presenting, they'd always be speaking about a specific animal or a specific system. And I think as my research took me deeper, I then chose a different perspective of looking at how I relate to the landscape. And this idea of totemism is, it's derived from where I come from in Botswana. So the idea of totemism is an indigenous way of preserving. So a culture or a clan would have a specific animal that they protect. And that means that you don't eat that animal or you don't hunt it, or you protect the landscape around where that animal resides. So ultimately, I felt like those two things then began to connect, where as soon as I chose the crocodile and found the mythological stories around it, it then slowly led me to this idea of death and what is unseen and what are the possibilities that the site could tell us, and how could I change my perspective of entering a site or interacting with the site where we don't preserve, I call it passive preservation, where you just have a fence and then you look at the beauty of the site as opposed to especially in South Africa. When people interact with nature, they are practicing rituals, they are walking into the site. So how could I allow users and architecture to become that medium to use the site and celebrate the memories and the ritual of the existing site?
No, awesome. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I think these presentations really gave us a lot to think about, and I'm really excited for the future for what you guys have to go on. I think if there aren't any other questions, we can then get to closing out. Just gonna give it a couple of seconds for any last call for questions for our speakers. All good. All right then. Yeah, January is almost done. 1/12 way through the year, guys. The longest month of the year is over. And we welcome the shortest month of the year coming through, and we're hoping to see you there in our event where we're going to be celebrating timber in design. So remember to sign up, and yeah, we hope to see you there. One more round of applause for our speakers, ladies and gentlemen. I think they were really awesome. You know, it gave us a lot to think about, especially being on a single site, but there you know, being so many different perspectives and, you know, research items that we can think about. And I think, you know, leaving with a lot more questions and a lot more conclusions is exactly why we do research. And I'm really glad to have, you know, the platform to have hosted these guys. So yeah, again, if you want to be part of our team, please join us. We need volunteers. A lot of work goes into this behind the scenes, and we really appreciate all the work and the effort that you have to share with us. Any sponsor that you might know, all the sponsorship goes towards CPD accreditation. Again, it's all a volunteer effort, so it feeds directly back into the event. Remember to follow us on our socials, and yeah, thanks again for attending. We'll see you soon.